Hello, everyone. Well, Pop's here, and I have been diligently working on my writing. And so we're ready now to drop the third chapter here on YouTube for you all who have been following the story along. So, without further ado, here is chapter 3. The captive secured, his instructions relayed to Zurek, Rosian spurred his mount in the direction of the keep. It would take the war party 5 days to march the distance to the keep, possibly more depending on the ability of those enslaved to keep pace with the war party. Traveling alone, mountain, Rosian could be back at the keep in 2 days. The first day would be traversing the countryside, enabling him to get within range for his portal spell to work. Despite what most people think, portal spells do not allow the casters to just teleport to any destination. First, a receiving circle must be cast upon the ground where the caster wishes to return to. Secondly, the caster must be within porting range of the receiving circle, the range varying with the skill and spell power of the caster. Being a mage of extreme power and skill, Rosian could port himself great distances, but not freely across the continent. The rules of magic applied to all who used it. Confined to a cell beneath the keep, the old man passed the long, agonizing hours of captivity pacing the perimeter of his tiny cell. The dim darkness of the musty basement prison was oppressive. There were no windows to allow sunlight or fresh air to penetrate. Twice a day, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed throughout the prison as his orc jailer descended the stairway, stopping in front of the cell door, a tray of moldy cheese, spoiled beef, or rotting vegetables, and a skin of tepid water in hand. The tray was slid into the old man's cell through a small cutout section at the base of the door. His jailer remained silent during these visits, and any attempts to engage him in a conversation were futile. He stood in solitude as he waited for the prisoner to empty the tray and slide it back through the opening at the base of the door. If the tray was not returned within what his jailer considered a reasonable amount of time, the heavy key was inserted into the lock, the door flung open, permitting the jailer to step inside, assaulting the old man as punishment, after which the jailer would retrieve the tray and, turning his back on the old man, exit the cell, locking it behind him. This was one of the first lessons imparted to the old man shortly after being shoved into his cell, a lesson that never needed repeating. Judging by the number of visits his jailer had completed, the old man estimated 3 days had passed since he allowed himself to be imprisoned. He was prepared to spend another 7 days confined to the small cell before he would abandon his plan and execute his escape. 8 more times did his jailer visit. Still the old man waited. However, he now took the time each day to rehearse and commit to memory the spells needed to effect his escape. Before the 9th jailer visit, a new sound drifted to the ears of the old man, the sound of soft-soled shoes descending the stairs. That this sound was not made by a new prisoner, the old man was certain, as there were no accompanying footsteps. The soft-soled footsteps grew in volume as the unknown visitor drew close to the cell door. And now there came a new sound, a rhythmic, faint tapping sound, coordinated with the approaching footsteps. The footsteps halted. The tapping ceased. Now the sound of a key being inserted into the cell door was heard, a metallic click, and the locking mechanism relinquished its rights to the door, allowing the new visitor to pull the door open. Rosian, the old man spat the words out with disgust. What is the meaning of this? Why have I been held prisoner by this rabble of yours? He inquired. Why, indeed, Rosian replied. Surely the student does not know more than the master, does he? You are no student of mine, Rosian, not any more, answered the old man, raising his voice. You were expelled many years ago from my tutelage. I remember, Rosian replied, exerting great effort to restrain the anger from his voice. Expelled, disgraced, and tossed out in the cold. The gate slammed shut and locked behind me. My supposed friends, fellow students, and even my own family turned their back on me. I was truly alone in the world. My only companion was the magic that burned inside of me. I vowed then and there that I would somehow have my revenge. Bah, the old man interrupted. You brought that upon yourself. A gifted and brilliant student you were, but your desire for power over others caused you to stray from the path of a true mage. In the darkness you practiced that which was forbidden, allowing the seed of lust, greed, power, and evil into your being, where you succumbed to its promise of greatness. No, Rojan, do not blame me or the Academy for your lack of courage and strength to defeat that which you brought into your world. You may be right, old master. However, it was that seedling that lifted me up that day, provided me strength to go on, and led me to a new master. For days I hiked through darkened forest, crossed barren fields of nothing but dust and sand, my throat burning, choking the very life out of me as it constricted, until at last I stood at the bottom of the Norandic Mountains. Rojan paused momentarily, recalling the helplessness of his situation. And then I heard it. A chilly voice with no emotion called to me from the top of the mountain. Are you truly defeated? It questioned me. Come, rise, climb. Atop the highest peak you will find one who desires to instruct you in the magic you seek. Come, learn, and you will never again feel helpless, defeated, or alone. This is my promise to you. I had right then and there two choices. I could lie down and surrender to the elements, my flesh and blood exposed to the vultures and other parasitic creatures to feed off of, or I could fight, dig deep down within myself and climb that mountain, not knowing what awaited me at the top. I stood there a moment, questioning my sanity, wondering if it was truly a voice that called out to me, or perhaps it was only the wind swirling and cascading down the mountainside, which an exhausted mind translated into a desired message. And did you find that which you sought at the top of the mountain? Asked the old man. After having decided to climb the mountain, Rojan continued, ignoring the old man's question, I began my ascent. I kept telling myself to just put one foot in front of the other, to ignore the pain which seemed to intensify with each step, forget the cold that penetrated the bones of my being, and ignore the thirst that so greatly needed to be satisfied. Standing there, listening to Rojan's tale, the old man noticed that Rojan seemed to no longer be in the present. His eyes had a far-off look to them, like they were seeing but blinded to what was currently around him. His voice no longer held any emotion as he continued relating the story. I had been climbing for an hour before I fell for the first time. I caught myself landing on hands and knees. Sharp rocks bit into the flesh of my palms, and they began to bleed. With blood trickling from my palms into the rocky ground underneath, I remained as I had fallen, gulping the cold mountain air, sucking it deep inside my lungs, feeling it oddly enough burning inside of me, only to forcefully exhale it out seconds later. I somehow managed to get my feet beneath me, steadied myself, and then continued my ascent. An hour passed, and then another. The air was getting thinner, my heart pumping harder and harder to circulate the blood to my brain and the rest of my body. I felt it then, a throbbing in my head, a cry for more blood from my brain. My fingers and toes grew numb, the brain having effectively won the battle, my body no longer pumping blood to my extremities. I fell again. Somehow I managed to roll over onto my back. Staring up, I pleaded with the sun, which glared at me from the early afternoon sky, to warm me, my pleas going unanswered. Laying there, helpless, shivering from the cold, my head throbbing, ears ringing, I resigned myself to my fate. I was going to die. It was comforting in a weird way, knowing that soon, very soon, I would be at peace. There would be no more pain, cold, thirst, or hunger. Tonight, my course would provide the wolves and coyotes of this mountain life. Closing my eyes, I sensed the essence of death encapsulating me, withdrawing my life from force from my body. my final moments on this plane of existence about to expire. Have you forgotten about your vow of revenge? The same cold, chilly voice screeched, somehow bypassing the life-stealing darkness, chasing away the peacefulness of death, returning the pain, cold, thirst, and hunger of life. Get up. All that you seek is within your grasp, but you must fight. Prove to me my faith in you has not been misplaced. Show me the courage and strength I know resides within you. Arise, screamed the eerie voice, arise. It was then I discovered within myself a hidden will to live, a stronger desire for revenge, and a greater thirst for knowledge such as I have never known. I stood up with conviction. Renewed energy flowed within me. The cold was replaced by an inner warmth. The hunger and thirst abated, and the pounding within my skull ceased. Looking up, I cursed the sun, swearing allegiance to the darkness. Affirming my curse, I turned my back on the setting sun, prepared to welcome the darkness of the approaching night. Not a moment longer did I remain standing there. Once again I began my ascent. There was no trail to follow, and I had to stop and scan the landscape, planning my route before setting off to the next stop where I would repeat the process all over. Time held no meaning, and I cannot recollect how many hours passed. I was no longer capable of thought. My body numb from the cold breeze that mercilessly assaulted me during my climb. Suffering from a lack of food and water, and having pushed myself beyond my physical limits, I now crawled on my hands and knees. The darkness of the night enveloped me. Oddly, it brought with it a feeling of comfort. It spoke to me, encouraging me not to quit. And then it happened. Glowing in the darkness, a path appeared. I somehow managed to stumble onto the path, though I knew not where it led. I instinctively knew that this was the path to my freedom, my salvation, and my destiny. At some point during the night, the terrain beneath my feet gradually began to change. I was no longer walking on hardened earth, tripping over stones that seemed to sprout up to hinder my progress. The earth softened, and I felt the softness of a grassy carpet beneath me. Vegetation sprung up on both sides of the path. The wind ceased, its violent attack on my being, now gently escorting the aromatic scents of nature to my nose. Buried somewhere within the aromas, I discerned the smell of a campfire. I froze. My eyes tried to penetrate the curtain of night, searching for the flicker of firelight in all directions. Off to my left I saw it, a brief glow in the darkness. Stepping off the path, I headed towards what I hoped would be warmth, food, water, and comfort. As I drew nearer, the scent of freshly roasted boar became distinct. My stomach rumbled its approval, reminding me that I had not eaten in a very long time. I cried out in the night, "Hello, anyone there?" There was no response. Twice more I cried out, coming closer and closer to the camp each time. Stepping out of the darkness into the light and warmth of the small campfire, I saw no one. On a crudely made table of wood, there was a skin of water, a plate of roasted boar meat, and cheese. Snatching up the skin of water, I brought it to my lips, and lifting the opposite end slightly higher, reveled in the delightful thirst-quenching water that spewed forth and slid down my throat. Having somewhat satisfied my thirst for the moment, grabbing a large chunk of boar meat, I savagely began to rip it apart into bite-sized pieces, tearing at it with my teeth. Switching between bites of boar meat and huge gulps of cold water, I feasted until I could neither eat nor drink any more. The warmth of the campfire washed over me. Lowering myself, I seated myself in front of the fire. Staring into the hypnotic flames of the fire, the softness of the grass underneath me, a full belly, and thirst that no longer needed attending to, I lay back and was soon lost in a deep, comforting sleep. From somewhere distant, beyond the comfort of my sleep and dreams, I heard voices. I could not make out what was being said, the language they spoke being unknown to me. Through the haze and fog of my sleep, I felt big, strong, rough hands reach down and grasp a hold of me. I was aware, yet not fully awake, as they half carried and half dragged me through the soft grass. Where they were taking me I had no idea, and though I tried to return to the present, the world of fantasy and dreams kept calling me back. I was awake, cold and wet. I opened my eyes to see two large orcs standing above me, both of them holding empty buckets that just seconds ago were full of water. Tossing aside the empty buckets, two sets of hands grasped hold of me and jerked me upright. I started to protest. A stinging slap across my face from one of the orcs ended any further protests I might have verbalized. Silently, I took note of my surroundings. I was in some sort of small prison cell. There was a straw mat in one corner, a sturdy door slightly ajar in front of me. I felt the coldness of the iron bands that were placed on my wrist. Rusty, heavy iron chains stretched from the bands, the ends of which were secured to the wall off to my left. Having enslaved me and confined me, the orcs withdrew from the cell, closing the door and locking the door behind them. I remained there, standing, hands by my side, the weight of the chains keeping them there, staring at the door, waiting for what would come next. "And," asked the old man, "what happened next?" "Yes, next. Well," Rojan replied, returning from wherever he had gone in the telling of his tale so far, "that is the story for another day. Tomorrow, perhaps. Right now I need to prepare for the arrival of our other guests. They will be here in 2 days." And without another word, Rojan shut the door on his old master, secured it, and handed the key to the orc jailer, whom had been standing nearby, just in case. Alone again, with only his thoughts for company, the old man pondered all he had heard today. The question most forefront in his mind was who instructed Rojan in his studies of magic? Who resided at the top of the Norandic mountain range? One thing was for certain. Whomever instructed Rojan was indeed skilled and powerful in the art of magic. Mentally, the old man began to compile a list of possible mages who possessed the skill and knowledge to have instructed Rojan in his studies. It was not a very long list, there being only 5 or 6 possible mages on his list. 2 of the names were immediately eliminated, death having claimed their lives. The other 4 mages on the list he could not recall a time when any of them had traveled to the northwestern border of Erland, a dry and barren wasteland, home of the Norandic Mountains. No, whomever resided atop of the mountain was someone whose identity remained a mystery to the old man. Engrossed in his thoughts, the old man did not even hear his jailer approach with his evening meal. The sound of the metal tray being slid into the cell startled him, returning his focus back to his present situation. Expecting another meal of moldy cheese, spoiled meats, and tepid water, the old man was surprised to see a tray of fresh bread, grapes, cheese, and venison, along with a skin of wine. It seemed now that the master was back in the keep, that some new rules had been set forth as far as his meals were concerned, or quite possibly, maybe this was to be his last meal. Snatching up the tray of food, he withdrew to the back of his cell, sitting himself on the cold brick floor of his cell. The food was prepared well, the wine a delightful treat to wash it all down with. This being his first enjoyable meal since his captivity, he was determined to enjoy it, even though he knew it would more than likely result in a harsh beating from his jailer for not returning the tray quickly. Expecting to hear the metallic click on the lock to the door of his cell any time now, he continued to eat slowly, alternating between the savory delight of the venison and the sweet taste of wine. Many minutes passed, yet he heard no sound of his jailer attempting to enter his cell. Finishing off the last of the grapes and cheese, the wineskin now emptied, the old man stood up and slid the tray through the small opening of his cell door. Tray in hand, his jailer secured the opening, the sound of his retreating footsteps echoing throughout the basement. 3 days had elapsed since David, Jack, Derek, Angie, and Keegan had been bound together. Surrounded by orcs and human mages, they were led further and further from their home. They marched in silence, sometimes traveling on open roads, while at other times they traipsed through thick forests. On more than one occasion, the procession was forced to a halt, the 5 bound prisoners having entangled themselves in their bonds, sending all 5 of them tumbling to the ground. They suffered no harm at the hand of those who marched alongside them, though the bonds themselves chased their wrists and necks. The soles of their feet began to blister and bleed, making it more difficult to walk, adding to the number of times they would stumble over one another, falling harshly to the ground, resulting in lacerations on their elbows and knees. Keegan, the youngest and smallest of the 5, struggled the most to keep up. Utterly exhausted from the past 3 days' march, Keegan could no longer maintain the pace, and twice in the past few hours had collapsed, once more dragging his friends down with him. Zorak, noticing that the procession behind him had yet again come to a halt, turned around to investigate it. Confirming his suspicion for the halt, he watched as the other members of the war party untangled the 5 bound prisoners, roughly assisting each of them to their feet. David, Jack, and Derek stood still as the orcs hauled Angie to her feet behind them, and then focused their attention on Keegan. 4 times they hauled him to his feet, only to have him return to the ground when left standing unassisted. Pointing to the orc nearest Keegan, Zurich uttered out a few commands and patiently waited as the orc produced a sharp dagger, cutting the restraints that bound Keegan to the others. Fearing the worst, the other 4 watched, expressions of terror and helplessness on their faces. It was not until they saw the orc wielding the dagger return the weapon to its sheath did they breathe a slight sigh of relief. The orc, after having stowed his weapon, reached down and lifted Keegan to his back, wrapping Keegan's arms about his neck and his feet about his waist. Zorak resumed his position at the head of the war party, signaling to the others to resume the march. The old man awoke to the sound of footsteps approaching his cell. That it was not his jailer bringing him another meal, he was certain. Rising to his feet, the old man stood in the center of his cell, waiting for the door to be opened. Knowing that within minutes the cell door would be opened, the old man instinctively began withdrawing select spell components from within the hidden pouches inside of his robes. Speaking barely above a whisper, he began to recite the words needed to cast a spell that would incapacitate those that now stood outside the door, should their intent be to harm him in any way. The spell almost complete, it would now take but a single word to cast. He stood there, prepared, as he heard the familiar sound of the key being inserted into the door and the metallic click of the locking mechanism being sprung free. When at last the door opened, the old man stood face to face with a party of 4 heavily armed orcs, one of them carrying a pair of iron shackles to be placed on his wrist. Weapons at the ready, the orc carrying the shackles entered the cell and motioned for the old man to hold out his wrist. Having made a split-second decision, the old man allowed the final word to the spell he was prepared to cast remain unspoken. Deliberately, the old man slowly withdrew his hands from behind his back, allowing the spell components to flow freely to the floor, and held them out in front of him. After affixing the shackles to the old man's wrists, the orc moved to stand aside of him, where, with a gentle push, he indicated that the old man was to follow them. 2 of the orcs started down the corridor in the direction of the staircase. Emerging from his cell, the old man followed their lead, the last 2 orcs trailing behind him. Without a word, his escorts led him up the stairs, through an open doorway. Turning to the left, they continued down a narrow corridor. Jeez. Other orcs stepping aside, allowing them to continue uninterrupted. They proceeded at an unhurried pace, their footsteps echoing throughout the keep as they made a series of rights and lefts, coming to a halt at the end of a corridor, a heavy wooden gate preventing them from going any further. One of the lead orcs approached the gate, knocking on it with a huge green fist. From the other side of the gate came a similar reply. After a few seconds, from the other side of the gate, the sound of guttural grunting could be heard, accompanied by the sound of long, unused metal gears. Seconds passed, and then, inch by inch, the gate began to rise. Sunlight invaded the void left by the rising gate. The old man was forced to avert his eyes against the brightness that grew in intensity as the gate lifted. The warmth of the sunlight felt delightful to the old man, and after a few seconds he was able to see clearly. Looking beyond the gate, the old man saw a rather large courtyard. Centered in the courtyard stood a mighty oak, many of its leaves having fallen from its branches like tears that had been shed as it witnessed the slow decay of the courtyard over the years. Against the left and right walls of what remained of them, were neglected gardens that at one time blossomed with beautiful flowers long since choked by the abundance of weeds that now sprouted in their place. Following his escort of orcs, the old man passed underneath the now raised gate onto a brick path. Most of the bricks beneath his feet were cracked, or in some spots missing completely. Seated at the opposite end of the path, behind a wooden table laden with various meats, fruits, and cheese, was Rosian. Across the table from Rosian, an empty chair awaited the old man's arrival. Seating himself in the chair, the old man sat patiently as Rosian continued his meal. A plate, as well as a chalice of wine, were placed in front of the old man by a servant. "First we eat," Rosian said. "Then I will tell you what you most wish to know." "And what is it that I most wish to know?" asked the old man, selecting an assortment of meats, cheese, and fruits to fill his plate. Waving away the question, Rosian returned his attention to the plate in front of him. For the better part of an hour, both men sat in silence, each enjoying a delicious prepared meal, which they washed down with gulps of wine between bites. Leaning back in his chair, having no desire to eat or drink no more, Rosian called forth his servant to remove the remaining meats, fruits, and cheese from the table. The servants, having completed the task of clearing the table, bowed before Rosian before taking his leave. Following the lead of the servant, the 4 orcs withdrew to the middle of the courtyard, far enough away to allow their master and the old man to speak in private, yet close enough to be able to reach the old man and subdue him if needed. "I know why you have come, and why you allowed yourself to be captured," Rosian spoke first. "I am aware of this so-called prophecy, and I have already taken the steps necessary to ensure that it does not come to pass. The 5 you seek are on their way here as we speak. Their capture took place 4 days ago, and tomorrow they will arrive under protection of a war party of my choosing. Pity you will not be here to effect their escape as well as yours. Yes, my old master, I know of your plan, and it has failed." "Am I to die this day, then?" asked the old man. "No, death would be too good for you," Rosian hissed. "You will live, and you will witness the vengeance I take on this world. You will watch helpless to stop me as I extend my control over Erland, enslaving its people, forcing them to bow beneath my power. I will rule this land, and all the while you will remain imprisoned in a cell which I have crafted just for you in the dungeon of my fortress in the Nordic mountains." Rosian continued vehemently. "I tell you this, Rosian," the old man stood and half leaned across the table, "you will never succeed. If not myself, then others will rise to stop you." "Then they too will meet the same fate as you," Rosian answered, rising from his chair, staring directly into the old man's eyes. "Now be gone from my sight. Guards, take this man to the fortress and lock him away in the cell that awaits him." Okay, there you have it. There is the 3rd chapter. Well, I hope you're enjoying the story so far. We are busy working on the next chapter, and we'll probably have that out in another week or so. Again, you are hearing a very rough draft that hasn't been gone through, so there are some spots there that are a little rough, as you heard. But please note this is my writing, and I welcome your comments, both good or bad, as long as they're done tastefully. If you have a criticism or a suggestion, please feel free to make it. And again, I hope you enjoyed the story so far, and look forward to reading the next chapter to you shortly. See y'all.